This is episode 342 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am pleased to be joined this week by Marc Scribner. He is a senior transportation policy analyst at the Reason Foundation, which is also a free market think tank that deals with a variety of national public policy issues. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Marc.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
Yeah, so why don't you briefly describe Reason Foundation and how you came to be guided by the great Bob Poole, the free market transportation guru that had an impact on yours truly back in my days at the National Taxpayers Union. You're working on free market concepts in transportation.
Yeah, so Reason Foundation has been around a while now. It was Bob was one of the co-founders back in 1978, and if your listeners aren't as familiar with the foundation's sort of the research work we do, they may be familiar with the magazine, Reason Magazine, which is a division of Reason Foundation. But I work with Bob on the transportation team in the research division, and that is, more the sort of the free market think tank, the policy research. And as you said, Bob has been the free market libertarian transportation guru for decades. He's continuing that work. And we really have our work cut out for us with what's going on in Washington now. We seem to be in this never-ending bailout culture that doesn't seem to be getting better. But we are looking at solutions more to the states to take more initiative themselves, take more control over their assets, and ultimately. A major interest of ours is trying to find innovative private sector support for public purpose projects. And Bob has really pioneered a lot of the kind of public-private partnership approaches to highway needs. We're continuing that kind of work. While I'm based in DC, we do a lot of work around the country. And it's around the country where you start seeing you can be a little more optimistic about things when you get down to the state and local level, obviously depending on the state and locality. But there are some innovative sort of approaches being tried out there. So I always, as bad as things can be in Washington, I always try to remember that there are good things happening out in the country.
Yeah, and I kind of have the same feeling about New Mexico. There's not a lot of good things happening right now in terms of policy reform in New Mexico, but there are good things happening in other states around the U.S. But let's talk a little bit about the DC approach to things, and we've got legislation. Quite honestly, that I haven't followed super closely, although it's been very controversial. There's a so-called transportation bipartisan bill or infrastructure bill, I'm sorry. And then there's the massive boondoggle Build Back Better, 3.5 trillion. Those have been held up for a while, but talk about those bills within the context of broader transportation and infrastructure policy.
Sure. So the Senate passed bill, which is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That's the $1.2 trillion, the traditional infrastructure bill. But even they say it's traditional infrastructure, but this is a very non-traditional approach. It rolls in a bunch of multi-year reauthorizations. And that's in large part how it gets to that big $1.2 trillion level. There's $550 billion above baseline in there, but there's a bunch of other programs that needed to be reauthorized, like the surface transportation programs. That's like the highway trust funds. Those are all in there, but not only are they all in there, they're significantly larger. Even though we set a record this last fiscal year on total expenditures for the traditional surface programs, about 63 billion a year. The average of the surface programs, traditional surface programs, assuming the Senate bill is enacted, would go up to 90 billion over average per year over 5 years. So that we're already seeing, even in the traditional sense, a 44% increase going out the door from Washington for highways, transit, are the big formula programs, but you've also got the discretionary programs at DOT and all the regulatory agencies that got beefed up funding. And then add on top of that the arbitrary numbers that they negotiated to dump into various modes of transportation. So it's a big mess to start with, and that's what the Senate has passed, and that was the bipartisan approach. Now the highly partisan Build Back Better Act, which is 3.5 trillion. There's a number of complications with that. A big one being the bipartisan negotiators were told that the $3.5 trillion bill wouldn't be double dipping on issues that they'd already addressed. Well, it turns out that it does. They tried some creative titling and created some joint agency programs to try to get around that, which really was a gentleman's agreement. But you're seeing a lot of irritation on the Senate side with the House that is, taking first whack at the Biden administration's preferred reconciliation approach. Right now where we are is we're a mess. No one knows exactly what is going to happen. The more moderate Democrats and some Republicans want to only pass the infrastructure, the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, whereas the progressives don't really care for that. They want the $3.5 trillion bill, and I think a lot of them would prefer the Senate's infrastructure bill to get defeated, because they know that they would have to go back and address those program reauthorizations. And what we saw from the House earlier on was a far more left-wing bill than what the Senate ultimately came up with. So I'm sure many of those House progressives would like to blow up that already bad $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill so they could try to come up with even worse bill. From my perspective, from their perspective, a better bill. But
well, here's hoping the whole thing blows up and they don't pass anything. And that isn't just a small government conservative libertarian type talking. That is somebody that understands that federal role in infrastructure really is not, it's not in the Constitution except for postal roads, whatever that means. It's pretty much been the state and local government's role to develop infrastructure, although there's a lot of private infrastructure around, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. Do you think that this just an idea, the idea of the federal government being in infrastructure by and large is a fallacious approach to begin with?
Well, it certainly doesn't make our infrastructure better in a lot of ways, and I think there's a lot of waste and misallocation of resources that comes with the federal role. But I think it's as you said, the state and local governments and the private sector have a very robust role in infrastructure, and even looking at things that we typically see as key areas of federal importance, like highways or mass transit. The federal government's only responsible for about a quarter of spending on those kinds of government surface transportation infrastructure. The rest comes from state and local governments, and the private sector in there a little bit. If you look at some, for instance, long-term public-private partnership, toll highways or toll lanes that have private financing. But yeah, I think the federal government, when we set up the modern system, it was to build the interstate highway system. Well, the interstate highway system has been essentially complete for 30 years. Meanwhile, these programs have continued on, and it's unclear what the value add is with the federal government, especially now that since 2008, we've been spending more money out of the trust fund than it's been bringing in user tax revenue. So we've been in a bailout culture with the federal role in transportation, of surface transportation, for more than a decade now. And when the coronavirus pandemic struck, all of that just got put on steroids, and it's just been bailout after bailout, and these latest bills are no different. So I don't know what we can do to reverse that, but it's certainly the problem of this role of the federal government in this. It's unclear what that is anymore now that the interstates are complete. But that the role is getting less and less connected with sort of building infrastructure that actually provides value to the economy, to the people.
Now, we could go into all manner of different aspects of transportation, and I think it's interesting to talk about one that doesn't get talked about a lot, and that is because I think widely speaking, people acknowledge that this particular mode of transportation works very well as currently formulated, and there's minimal reasons for government to engage with it. And I'm talking about the freight railroad system in the United States, which is the envy of the world, manages its own transportation infrastructure, and really, just to top it all off, last year was the 40th anniversary of the Staggers Act, which deregulated freight rail. But you've written a policy brief, Pathways and Policy for 21st Century Freight Rail. People don't think about it because government, by and large, doesn't engage with it. That may be changing, but talk a little bit about why this particular mode of transportation is so successful and how we can keep it successful for the future, as you highlight in your very good brief.
Yeah, and I think freight rail provides, I think, so many good examples to a sort of a transportation policy free marketeer, because as you said, it was nearly regulated to death. And then as soon as the federal government took its boot off its neck, it rapidly regained vibrancy, and as you said, today it's the envy of the world, and really the most other countries don't have a private intercity rail system, but we do. And it's the most extensive and productive. And just to give your listeners some idea of how bad things were and how much they've improved since the Staggers Rail Act of 1980. Today we see, compared to 1980, we see inflation-adjusted average freight rates down by 44%, train accident rates down by 75%, employee injuries and occupational illnesses down by 83%, and all while the freight railroads, the private freight railroads, have invested more than $750 billion, of their own funds to revitalize their network and support a 75 increase in freight volume. So, and another thing, what pre-Staggers Act, when there was serious talk in Washington that we might have to nationalize the railroads until they figured out that deregulation was a better idea. The industry tracked a metric of standing derailments, and that was the infrastructure was so dilapidated that stationary rail cars, so just sitting on the track, would tip over because the roadbed would crumble below it. So that was an industry metric that was tracked, and it shows just how bad the generations of overregulation, of ever ratcheting regulation of freight rail, the kind of damage that did. Today, we have a very, very vibrant and competitive freight rail system, even though they've been thrown some curveballs. I mean, their biggest, commodity for many, many decades was coal. Well, we've been, the country has been transitioning away from coal-fired electricity. So just in the last about a decade, coal volume is down half. So what have they been doing to try to access new markets and remain competitive and viable? Well, they've turned to things like intermodal, the shipping of containers, and that is where you most directly compete with trucks. And this competition is very intense. Unfortunately, there is a growing chorus among some in Washington that this is an anti-competitive industry, and we need more regulations. We need to do all the sorts of things that nearly ruin the industry. I hope we learned our lesson, but we'll see.
Yeah, before we get to that, I want to talk about a few things. One is I have a fact sheet from the Association of American Railroads showing some of the data pertinent to New Mexico. Now, historically speaking, just as an aside, New Mexico being a Western state, the railroads were deeply influential in the state's founding, as the railroads took people from the east to the west. And yeah, there were interactions with Native Americans and the whole nine yards, and I'm not going to get into that, but deeply impactful technology historically here in New Mexico. But there's 6 freight railroads operating in New Mexico. Mostly that's BNSF and Union Pacific. 1,873 miles of freight rail working in our state, and average wages of over $120,000. That's wages and benefits per employee. So well-compensated group of folks there, and obviously a major impact on the state. Marc, have you ever been to New Mexico? I'll just throw that curveball at you.
Unfortunately, I have not made it to New Mexico. I've made it. I've been to Texas and Arizona. I haven't been able to make it there though. So
well, that's
soon,
okay.
I plan to.
Well, you should be here right now, not because of this podcast per se, but because the International Balloon Fiesta is going on, and that's a whole different mode of transportation.
I've seen photos of that.
Yeah,
but I would love to see something like that in person.
Yeah, this is a great time to be here. But going west out of Albuquerque, all the way to the Arizona state line, if you're on I-40, some of the busiest tracks you'll find BNSF has on the freight side going through Gallup and out, I assume, out to the West Coast and LA or Long Beach or whatever ports they're servicing. And there's just a lot of important rail infrastructure in New Mexico. But talk a little bit about, you alluded to it, the freight rail manages its own infrastructure. And, this is kind of the joke line about libertarians is that, who's going to build the roads? The railroads, and yes, rail versus an interstate highway or something, they're different. But I have utter confidence that given today's technology, that if some replica of you or I took charge and said, we're going to privatize the highways, that could be done. But leaving that aside, talk about how the railroads came to manage their own infrastructure. And I don't know if you can throw in a quick conversation about Amtrak, which of course we have the Amtrak president there that interaction, I think, perplexes a lot of people, but definitely want to hear about how this wide infrastructure is managed.
Yeah, so I think you know, railroads had the advantage of always being private in the United States. So there was nothing, there was never outside of, there was a brief instance during the First World War when Woodrow Wilson nationalized the railroads, but otherwise, this has been a private industry. Now it's been regulated very poorly during some of its history, but it's always financed its own infrastructure improvements, managed its own operations, things that the public sector does with highways. And I think that, this is also an important point that's often lost on policymakers, is that because the railroads both own and operate their infrastructure and the carriage of goods on that infrastructure, they internalize those costs. They're not, there aren't the kind of subsidies that you see in highways, which are, largely due to the fact that the way we allocate highway costs does not take into account the fact that nearly all the damage done to roads is done by the heaviest of heavy trucks, who also happen to be the chief competitors of freight railroads. So they're, not only are they privately financed and all that, they're competing with a publicly subsidized competitor. And so I think part of the problem is that a lot of people don't realize that the railroads are private, because they think of Amtrak, which is, a government corporation that was stood up by Richard Nixon, and everyone thought it was going to be a temporary program. Like so many government programs, temporary government programs, it's persisted for decades now. And Amtrak, a lot of people also don't know that the vast majority of the miles that Amtrak services throughout the country on the long distance routes, those are owned by these private freight carriers. Amtrak really only owns the Northeast corridor between Washington, D.C. and Boston, segments there. So, Amtrak is this subsidized passenger carrier that was created to relieve the freight railroads, which by 1970 were really struggling under the heavy burden of regulation. And, they had been cross-subsidizing passenger service for decades, and just got to the point where they could no longer do that. They were all going bankrupt at that time. So I think part of it is just this public perception where, the freight railroads, since they've been deregulated, they kind of just do their thing, and it's out of sight, out of mind. They're not begging for money from Congress, but who is, getting annual appropriations from Congress? That's Amtrak. Which really, when you consider the extent of what our railroads do, passenger service is such a minor part of that. But because I think it also it helps that that Amtrak services Washington, D.C. So you've got a lot of politicians, and they call it the Acela corridor, people going between New York and DC, the high rollers, the political and financial set. That's what they see. That's what they experience. I mean, unless you're, trespassing and sneaking onto a boxcar, you're probably not, which don't do that, please. But you're probably not directly experiencing freight rail unless you're in a business that's, a shipper, or you're providing equipment. It's just like I said, it's out of sight, out of mind for the vast majority of people, including those in Washington, who should be a little more up to speed on our nation's infrastructure.
Now, I wrote a piece at National Review about Jimmy Carter and contrasting him with Joe Biden and his presidency. And I have many kind things to say about Carter, who, like I said earlier, deregulated, along with Congress, the rail industry, the freight rail industry, that is. Joe Biden and current Democrats seem inclined to, in many ways, start peeling back the success of deregulation that went forward and has been successful for 40 years plus uh, from the Carter days. Talk about what's going on in rail and potentially regulation of rail uh, that is in these bills and other policies that are going on.
Well, the House bill that I mentioned earlier, the House infrastructure bill that got sidelined in favor of this Senate 1.2 trillion, had a number of bad policies that would negatively impact the rail industry. And it's good that the Senate bill does not have that. That is one sort of silver lining, I guess, with the Senate bill. As for the Biden administration itself, one concrete thing that they explicitly mentioned in the July executive order 14036 on supposedly enhancing competition in the American economy was a regulatory proposal on reciprocal switching. And this is gonna, I'll try to get into the weeds and then get right back out, because it's not, it's pretty inside here, but it's very significant. Basically, so reciprocal switching is a practice where so you've got a railroad one for a fee would handle the cars of railroad two, so that the railroad two, if it doesn't have direct access to, say, a distribution center or factory, could offer single line service that competes with that first railroad's actual single line service. So it's sort of, it creates through contract kind of virtual single line service that allows two freight railroads can interchange each other's traffic. And this gets done on a voluntary basis in the industry, today. But what this executive order was alluding to was a proposal that came from the chemical industry, and they spent, basically when the railroads got deregulated, the chemical industry started almost immediately calling for them to be re-regulated. It's just a rent-seeking sort of habit of theirs. And what that proposal would do would eliminate a requirement that anti-competitive conduct be found prior to the imposition of reciprocal switching. And they're basically the arguments, and this was before a little-known regulator called the Surface Transportation Board, STB, or Surfboard, if you want to get cute. The argument was, well, we haven't been able to uncover any evidence of anti-competitive conduct on the part of railroads for decades, since this standard was established by the infamous former regulator, the Interstate Commerce Commission, and affirmed by the courts. So because we couldn't find any evidence, we're just going to eliminate that requirement that you find this evidence, and we're going to, let you convict the railroads for, crimes that they, couldn't find evidence that they committed. So that's what that was alluding to, and it wasn't clear in the executive order that specifically was it. But it was interesting to see him specifically call out not only a regulatory proceeding at a kind of a sleepy regulator, but this is an independent regulator that doesn't report to President Biden. This is the Surface Transportation Board has always been decisionally independent, but recently became administratively wholly independent from the Department of Transportation. So it's for people who generally have concerns about executive overreach and the abuse of sort of the president's bully pulpit, this should be concerning, just as on those grounds. But I think what would happen if they were to go forward with this regulation? the modeling, the sort of the simulation that's been done shows that this is going to create all sorts of bottlenecks in the freight rail network, which ultimately are going to disadvantage customers who want their goods moved to where they want them on time. And so you're going to end up with degraded service. It's sort of a backdoor way to impose price controls. And ultimately, I fear that we would be sort of backsliding into the kind of the pre-Staggers era that I thought that everyone, at least with authority, understood. There's bipartisan recognition on the amazing success of the Staggers Freight Act, and I think it's a great case study for those interested in free market economic policy. But we're now at a time where there seems to be serious people in serious positions of authority who don't believe the success of the Staggers Act, and apparently are unafraid of the potential consequences that it could bring on both the industry, but on the American economy writ large.
Yeah, and kind of related to that, and one of the reasons that it seems like the Biden administration wants to jump into re-regulating freight rail is because of its green credentials. It's long been known, at least I've known it for many years, that freight rail is the greenest way to transport goods, not necessarily people, because lumber sits right on each other. It's very dense and compact. Human beings, I've been on plenty of trains, and no desire to be shoved into a train a la the way they do things in Japan. I just don't think that would fly very far here in the United States. But because of its greenness, freight rail is being kind of targeted by the Biden administration.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I note that in the reason brief you mentioned. It's a very strange position for the Biden administration to take. I mean, they say that climate change poses existential risks, yet here they are essentially talking about kneecapping the mode of transportation that uses produces about 1/10 the amount of greenhouse gases per ton mile as trucks, their main competitors, and who would have the most to gain from a weakened, over-regulated freight rail system. So and you're absolutely right that this is it's to hear them say that we're very concerned about the environment and then coming around doing this, I mean, doesn't make a lot of sense. But they're also, I mean, I think it's hard to say why the motivation for this one, but there's another example of going after the freight railroads that I think is clearer where their interests lie, and that's on the case of the one man crew, or the potential to have minimum crew size regulations, which is something some states have pursued. And the Obama administration looked at this, but ultimately didn't proceed to a final rule on it. But that is coming from the labor unions, and that is something, at least there, President Biden said on the campaign trail that he was going to, look at imposing that kind of regulation. So that is, I mean, that's more normal, but the sort of the green contradiction here is something I don't think has been getting a lot of attention, but it's definitely a contradiction. And if you are an environmentalist supporter of the President Biden, this is something you should maybe call him on, because yeah, it's going after the most environmentally efficient mode of transportation, probably not a good idea if you are trying to pursue better environmental outcomes.
All right. Well, that covers most of what I wanted to talk about in terms of freight rail and what's going on and some of the history. Any details that we missed that you want to share with our audience in the last couple of minutes?
Well, I think, this is something that's going to, the good news, I think, is I'll say, I'll end this on good news. The Surface Transportation is a conservative regulator. It is. I think that there's institutional memory there of what happens when overregulation really takes hold of an industry.
So just to be clear, you're
So
talking about the Surface Transportation Board, which is kind of the regulator of freight
that is
rail and
the economic regulator of the freight railroads. I think there are a lot of people there who did learn the lessons of the pre-Staggers and post-Staggers outcomes. So, I think there's hope that sort of sanity will prevail, and that we won't do this backslide that the results are so predictable and so terrible. So I think that is sort of the good news, is that the general posture of the regulator in question has throughout its entire history been very cautious.
all right. Well, hopefully that optimistic note wins out. And I've always just trains are cool. Trains are lots of fun. Model trains coming up for the holidays. There's always displays of those, and it really is to me interesting, the double edged sword of trains in general in our society, where you have probably the least subsidized form of transportation, which is, of course, freight rail, and then the very most subsidized form of transportation, which is either mass transit just in cities, or here we have a commuter rail system, or Amtrak. Very, very wasteful financially, and not as energy efficient as its supporters like to believe, those systems. And kind of funny that they both fly under the same basic technology.
Right. Rail is great at moving stuff, not so great at moving people.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time. Again, Marc, your paper is at reason.org, Pathways and Policy for 21st Century Rail. Again, that's from September 8th, 2021. And thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.